Substitute teacher plans. Miss Huff looked over her class and sighed deeply. Sarah was sticking her tongue out at Billy. Billy was making faces at Carl. Nancy blew such a big bubble that she floated across the room and got stuck in Francine's hair. Alan was swinging from a rope hooked to the lights, pretending that he was Tarzan, screaming, "Aye! Hey!" Greg was growling like a wild animal. "I need a break," Miss Huff moaned. "I need a vacation day." That night, she decided to make up a list of substitute teacher plans and a list of fun things she could do on her day off. Miss Huff did her substitute plans first. Then she began her list of fun things to do. She got very excited and happily wrote and giggled through the night. The next morning, a very tired Miss Huff glanced at her 2 lists. "Oops," she thought, "I forgot to write substitute teacher plans on the top of this list." Poor Miss Huff was so exhausted, though, that she wrote it down on her own list of fun things to do. Then Miss Huff drove to school and put the wrong list on her desk for the substitute teacher. Uh-oh. What's going to happen? A little while later, Miss Huff rushed back home and looked over her list of things to do on her day off. The first activity said reading, 9:15 to 10:30. "Oh, goody," she chuckled. "I just love to read." Miss Huff plopped down in a chair with a joke book. Before long, she was giggling and laughing and rolling on the floor. Even her cat Rudy joined in. Why don't monsters eat clowns? Because they taste funny. Back at school, Miss Martin, the substitute teacher, looked at her list of plans. The first activity said, ride the roller coaster at Ocean Park. Said Miss Martin. Said Miss Martin. "I'll need a bus to get us there." She called the front office for assistance. Before long, she and the children were buzzing on the gigantic roller coaster with their hands in the air. "Whee!" they screamed. "Yahoo!" laughed Miss Martin in return. At home, sweet home, Miss Huff set her joke book down and read the next activity on her list. It said, writing, 10:30 to 11. "Ah," sighed Miss Huff, "just what I've been wanting to do." She brought out her address book and began writing to all of her relatives and friends. It felt good to stay in touch. She smiled as she wrote. Back at school, Mrs. Martin looked at her list of plans. The next activity said, skydiving. Oh, Mrs. Martin made sure all the children's parachutes were fastened tightly as the plane sliced through the air. "Okay, kids, on the count of 3, we zip out the door one by one as quickly as we can. 1, 2, 3, Geronimo!" The children formed a gigantic star. It was a sight to see. At home, sweet home, Miss Huff looked at her list. It said, spelling, 11 to 11:30. She and Rudy played Scrabble. Miss Huff won. Rudy growled. See, look, they're playing Scrabble. And here's the words: vacation, fun, catnip, rest, and mouse. Those are good words. Back at school, Mrs. Martin gazed at her list of plans. The next activity said, scuba diving. It was very exciting for the children to swim in the water with all the marine life. They watched in amazement as the octopus playfully pulled Mrs. Martin through the water. It says, yay. At home, sweet home, Miss Huff gazed at her list. The next activity said, lunch and recess, 11:30 to 12:30. After eating a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, Miss Huff played hopscotch with Rudy. Rudy won. Miss Huff growled. Back at school, Mrs. Martin looked at her list of plans. The next activity said, lunch on mountaintop and ski down. The bus strained as it climbed to the tallest mountain imaginable. It was called Forever Snow Mountain. Look at Forever Snow Mountain, where the skiing is great 9 months of the year. After lunch, the children zigged and zagged down the slope, while Mrs. Martin accidentally set a record for the longest ski jump. All the children clapped when she landed on one ski. At home, sweet home, Miss Huff looked at her list. The next activity said, read book aloud, 12:30 to 1. Miss Huff read to Rudy. Rudy purred. Back at school, Mrs. Martin looked at her list of plans. It said, build huge sand castle. When they got to the beach, Mrs. Martin rented a steam shovel. She and the children created an amazing castle. It was huge. It even had a helicopter landing pad. At home, sweet home, Miss Huff whispered to herself, I sure feel rested. She looked at her list. The next activity said, math, 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock. I've always loved math. She pulled out her checkbook and paid her bills. It felt wonderful. Back at school, Mrs. Martin looked at her list of plans and smiled. Ooh, what's it going to be next? And in no time, all the children were at the school. In no time at all, the children were at the circus. They laughed at the clowns, clapped for the trapeze artists, and gasped at the lion tamer, who just happened to be Mrs. Martin. That's why Mrs. Martin was such a great substitute teacher. Anybody who could train lions could handle kids. Wow. At the end of the day, after Mrs. Martin excused the children, she wrote a note to their teacher. See, Miss Huff. Dear Miss Huff, I had a terrific day. You write very good substitute teacher plans. The children were well behaved, much better than the lions. Sincerely, Mrs. Martin. The next day at school, Mrs. Huff felt very energetic. She was teaching up a storm until the principal walked in with a list of yesterday's activities. Miss Huff, I think you have some explaining to do, he said, and handed her the list. Goodness sakes, said Miss Huff, I need another vacation day. Now, although the children had fun with Mrs. Martin, they really loved Miss Huff, even if they didn't always show it. Oh, please, Miss Huff, they chorused. Please be here tomorrow. Miss Huff looked at her students, then glanced at the list again and shook her head. She reached for the phone. I would like to make a reservation for acrobatic flight training tomorrow, she said. All the children sighed. For how many? Miss Huff winked. Well, 1 adult and 25 children, and we might as well bring along our principal.